after the event today. Well, I think that without further ado, we can let's have a look at the agenda for today. Well, we'll start with some welcome and introduction word from Alexander Natz from EUCOPE, and also some a few words on the EU level implications of COVID-19. Then we move on to Joe Damond from Bio. Joe will talk us through the also the impact of COVID-19 on Bio and how the association responded to the crisis. Then we'll deep dive a little bit more on the practical consequences and also on the pipeline concerning COVID-19 with Phyllis Arthur and David Thomas from Bio. And how the sector, I would say, worked with the public institutions in the US to provide the response as well. Then we'll have Monica Diaz from the European Medicines Agency. Monica will detail a little bit the EMA reaction in terms of regulatory flexibility, but also in terms of supply chain issues. Then we have the point of view of the member states of France, actually, with the perspective from Antoine Jourdan from the Ministry of Economic Affairs from France. Antoine will talk us through the France Relance Plan with measures to recover from the pandemic. Then finally, we have the perspective from a biotech company with Julien Patrice from Alnylam. And Julien will detail us a little bit on how Alnylam well, put efforts to fight against the pandemic, but also we will discuss the midterm consequences for biotech in a post-COVID-19 world. Then we have some Q&A with the audience in an open floor discussion with the audience, and we'll end with some concluding remarks from Alexander from EUCOPE. So we have again a rich agenda ahead of us. So I suggest we move on with the first speaker with you, Alex, from EUCOPE. Please, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Thank you very much for organizing this. I'd like to say a big thank you also to the colleagues from Bio. It's a great pleasure to organize such an important webinar together with Bio. But also I'd like to say a big thank you to EMA to be here. I think it's important to have EMA in this webinar. Likewise, the French Ministry of Economics. It's great to have a member state on board to talk about the reaction to the COVID-19 crisis. And last but not least, also to hear from you, Julien, your perspective from a biotech company. So also big welcome from my end for this webinar. Let me move to the next slide here. Laurent, are you doing the slides or?
Yeah, you should see it right now.
No, yeah, here we are. Well, first of all, I think it's a critical time to look back into the last half year. And as you all know, a lot happened during the months of March and April. There have been a lot of groups founded and met on a regular basis in the European Commission together with industry over the months of March, April, May and June to talk about the crisis, and that has been going down quite a bit. I don't think there is that much of an activity these days, although we're living in a time where the crisis is far from being over. So I think it's very important to look back into the last 6 months, and I've been picking some examples of what has been happening, and also I think we will hear later on what's been happening in the US, and also what's the perspective of a mid-sized biotech company having products in the market with Alnylam. So when the crisis hit, the European Commission, and I must say, it's a pity that the Commission couldn't join here today, but I must say a big compliment to the Commission for organizing discussions with industry, with European Medicines Agency, but also ECDC, which has been coming into a more prominent role recently in Europe, the European Center for Disease Control. I think the agency in the West would be the CDC, which is much more prominent in the media, I think. But I think also I must say that ECDC has done a great job in giving guidance to cancer patients, what to do in times of a crisis, how to react to certain situations. And EMA likewise has done a tremendous job, if I may say that, in issuing very clear but also timely guidance on regulatory flexibilities, but also on supply chain issues. I think Monica will talk about this later on in greater detail, so I wouldn't want to go into the details. But what I wanted to say here in my first slide is it's a big thank you, I think, from the industry side, that we have been able to work with the European Commission, with EMA, and with ECDC on a regular basis in weekly calls when the crisis was at its peak. I think that has worked quite well. And now we are looking into how do we react to what we've been seeing. And a lot of what we've been seeing have been, shortages issues. There have been issues where I think it was mainly paracetamol. It was not able to get a batch or a huge bag of paracetamol out from India into the European Union. So there have been lots of issues where products, or better to say APIs, have been kept in custody. And I think, again, the Commission has been very helpful in that respect. There have been, I would say, more shortages in the generic sector than in orphan drugs. We, from our members, haven't heard very much about shortages, I must say. We've repeatedly asked our members, do we see issues in orphan drugs or cell and gene therapies? And we haven't had very much of a feedback, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been significant and very severe shortages and supply chain issues in other products. And namely, ICU medicines have been partly in shortage. And I think Medicines for Europe, if I may say that, has done a good job in compiling a list of ICU medicines and bringing all the stakeholders together to make sure that we can work on preventing shortages. I think that's a big lessons learned, that only a multi-stakeholder, industry-wide approach it worked in times of a crisis. And I think we haven't prevented everything, but we have prevented a lot in terms of both shortages in medical devices, but also shortages in medicines, mainly in ICU medicines. Now, that led into a discussion in Brussels around the dependency on API production, which was partly there before, but which clearly has increased over the last 6 months. And I think it is somewhat important that we're having this discussion in what we call in Brussels the pharma strategy, which is somewhat leading the way into the next 10 or even 15 years of the pharmaceutical strategy, which deals with various different issues, from pricing issues to also issues around API dependency. And there are questionnaires out from the European Commission asking around what type of measures could work in that respect. And I think here we have to be very careful not to be too drastic in the measures which we're initiating, in terms of it might make sense to bring back some API production into Europe, but we have to be very reasonable and looking also at, for some of very complex products like in cell and gene therapies, I don't think it's needed that we have all the production done in the European Union. I mean, the production needs to take place where the facilities are, where the technical know-how is. So I think here we have to be balanced, and that's one point I wanted to make here. Yeah, I mean, there has been this list of ICU medicines. The Commission has done a good job in prioritizing and securing demand, I must say. There is this long-term strategy in the pharma strategy. And I think, once again, I think the collaborative approach of all stakeholders has helped tremendously in Europe to make sure we could actually prevent the worst. If we move on to the next slide, Laurent, I think what's worrying me very much is the long-term or mid-term effect. And I think Julian will talk about this later on. Okay, that was already the last one, sorry. But what worries me a bit is the long-term and mid-term effects of the crisis. And that's more like the economic part of things. What we do see is an increasing discussion at the member state level. And you all know Europe is very much about the member state level when it comes to pricing and reimbursement of medicines. So what we see there is an increased discussion about how can we actually save money also in pharmaceuticals. I mean, we have seen clawback mechanisms where there's a clawback from industry across the board of a certain amount, which is predefined by the beginning of the year, or there are certain thresholds which, if exceeded, then industry needs to pay back. So I think in order to keep Europe attractive for innovative companies, we are in a critical times in Europe these days, because the Commission is looking into incentives. It's looking into orphan drug exclusivities. Are those exclusivities needed? We've seen case law from the European Court of Justice somewhat restricting the SPC exclusivity. So we have some trends in Europe which partly worries me on the IP front. I think that's important to mention here. And at the same time, we might see some tendencies at the member state level to be much more on the cost-cutting end of cost containment measures, to be focusing a bit more on just purely savings, to not give enough reward for investment for orphan drugs and other innovative products. And I think that's something which we need to watch very carefully. What are the reactions at the member state level? In a nutshell, I think at the Brussels level, and that's my final point here, and I will repeat that, I think the collaboration has somewhat worked. We need to take the lessons learned in the pharma strategy and in other pieces of potential legislation. But the discussion is ongoing, and I think that's important. And already the Commission has reached out again to speak to the key stakeholders, the pharma trade organizations, to see what are the lessons learned from the last 6 months. So the next call is going to take place next week. So I think that shows me that we've done great work. Also, the flexibility within EMA, which has been provided in the regulatory field, but also to make sure that we have a speedy access or authorization for COVID-19 medicines, and potentially in the future also vaccines. I think there's a huge supply issue around how can we bring up supply. There's a huge effort from industry to collaborate on supply to meet the demand whenever the vaccine is available hopefully in the next couple of 6 months, 9 months whatsoever. So once again, thank you very much for being with us today. And that was my short introduction. And with that, back over to you, Laurent, or should I hand over immediately to Joe?
No, thank you, Alex, for this very interesting zoom into what happened at the EU level. And indeed, unless we have a burning question from the audience, maybe we can move on to our next speaker, to Joe from Bio, to also give us a little bit of an intro to what happened in the US and also how Bio reacted. So, Joe, you are the Executive Vice President in charge of international affairs at Bio. As such, you are responsible for developing and implementing the Industry Association's program of international advocacy and outreach, including the areas of trade policy and foreign government relations. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you, Alex, for working with us today on this event. We're really pleased at Bio to be collaborating with EUCOPE on what is a critical issue. I will try to save some time so we can get to the meat of the discussion that my colleague will present. I think people know about Bio. Laurent already presented it. We're the world's largest biotech association. We have members, we have over 1,000 members. Most of them are small companies, most of them are startups in 30 countries around the world, although certainly most of them are in the United States right now. I want to say that my colleagues will demonstrate in a few minutes how unprecedented the response by particularly small companies, as Dave Thomas is going to show you, has been to COVID pandemic crisis in just this year. The world's never seen anything like it. I'll leave it to Dave to explain the details of that. There's also been unprecedented, I would say, private sector and government collaboration, both in the United States and Europe, and also in other countries around the world, to work together to make sure that people can get access to the technologies, the vaccines, the other treatments, once they are available and once they've been approved by the regulatory agencies. And by the way, I also want to say I very much appreciate the engagement today of the EMA in this call. They're very important to us. We view these issues as being global. And also the French Ministry of Economic Affairs. You know, we see all of these issues as being something where all the key governments around the world need to be engaged. Phyllis Arthur, my colleague, will be talking about our engagement with the US government to work toward, you know, making sure that there are, you know, that we can develop, that the ecosystem that we have can develop these treatments, vaccines as quickly as possible. I just want to focus on a couple of things real quickly. One is just to note how much global collaboration has been part of this. This has not been in terms of dealing with vaccines or developing vaccines and other treatments. This has not been something that's been going on within individual countries, the United States, or within individual countries in Europe. There's been tremendous amount of cross-border collaboration. I think many of you are familiar with, for example, Pfizer's partnership with Biotech in Germany to develop a vaccine. But that's just one. There's also, I could name many others of a similar nature that are so important. And it really shows how important it is to keep the ability to do these cross-border collaborations alive through government policy and going into the future. I want to talk just a minute about the global implications, which will very much echo, I think, what Alexander was just saying. He had a couple of slides on EU level implications. Well, let me just say from a bio perspective, and I'm sure Alex would agree with this probably, you know, that these are actually global implications. Some of the issues that you're facing within Europe, we're facing within the US, but I see them as issues that all countries around the world are going to have to be participating in and be engaged in. I just want to mention four of them real quickly. One is one that Alex touched on, which is supply chains. I think it's really important in the short run that we don't disrupt global supply chains in the midst of a crisis. These took a long time to build. They ensure that, you know, supply gets to patients, and let's not disrupt them in the middle of a crisis. We do acknowledge, though, that many countries are asking questions about their local capacity and their ability to, you know, make sure that their patients get access to medicines in this crisis and in future crises. Those are obviously legitimate questions. Our key point there, and this includes the United States, where there have been executive orders to talk about locating more supply of essential medicines in the United States. Our key point with the US government on this has been to focus on the importance of the redundancy and the resilience of supply chains, and not to make them more brittle or single source. And this means having sources in different countries. Sure, you want local sources, but that should not be exclusive. Secondly, an issue that we're watching closely is the issue of intellectual property rights. I think everybody that works in this sector knows that it's the engine of innovation. I think as an industry, it's very clear that we believe that global access to these new technologies when they come out, the vaccines or the treatments, is going to be vital, and that our companies are willing to work and do deals with countries around the world to make sure that patients and different income levels get access to new technologies. We think those can be, you know, worked on in a very cooperative manner between the companies that are developing the technologies and between the governments who need the technologies. We would caution against heavy-handed or coercive takings of intellectual property rights from the people who have developed them. We think it undermines the incentives for innovation. We think it will introduce all sorts of delays. And the people who are developing this technology, it's very new. It's better to, in principle, to work with the people who have just finished developing it. So we're keeping an eye on intellectual property rights, but we are keeping, even more importantly, the focus on access to innovation. Third, Alexander touched on this, looking very closely at the regulatory implications now and in the future from COVID. These are global issues as well. What implications does this important focus on COVID approvals? Is it going to have any implications for approvals of technologies that are not COVID related, but are nonetheless still important? Is it going to slow that down? We need to keep, as I agree with Alexander, we need to keep the flow of those processes going. And are there any lessons we can learn for the future about how to make regulatory processes so efficient? They've had to react very quickly in response to the COVID crisis. Are there any lessons we can learn from that in the future, either with respect to future crises or with respect to just the regulatory systems in general, making them more responsive to unmet medical needs? And finally, I think, we're looking at, and Phyllis can talk more about this, lessons for future pandemics. Look, in retrospect, all of us, companies, governments, could have probably done a better job preparing for this pandemic, which people have been talking about that was going to happen for many years, and it finally did happen. Well, we want to make sure that our responses to the next pandemic crisis learn the lessons from this crisis, from COVID, so that we do a better job next time. So that's going to be very important to us too. The final point I just want to say is to align myself with what Alexander was saying about valuation and pricing and reimbursement of new technologies and the issues that healthcare systems are facing. We want to make sure, look, this industry is stepping up to help solve, and if this ecosystem did not exist, it could not happen, that we were stepping up so quickly to deal with the COVID crisis in an unprecedented way, as Dave Thomas is going to describe in a minute. We need to keep that ecosystem of innovation alive. And that means that this risky ecosystem that I know people know about continues to, is going to continue to require sufficient returns on investment, to be frank, in order to keep these engines, especially for these engines of innovation, especially for the small companies. We're following this around the world in the US. We're very concerned, and our own government recently issued a proposed regulation that would tie US prices to some of our government programs to the lowest OECD price. Well, this could very quickly lead to a downward spiral in terms of the kinds of returns that you're able to get on this risky investment, expensive investment that companies are making. So it's really important in this time of crisis that we recognize the value of what we have in this ecosystem. Europe and around the world, where we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of small companies that are working to solve these health problems, not just COVID, but other ones as well. So we're very mindful of that issue as well. I will stop there. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you again, Alex and Laurent, for inviting us to collaborate with you on this. I hope it's just the first in what could be a number of future collaborations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joe, for sharing with us your BIO's priorities and also a reaction to COVID-19. And I think we can indeed see a lot of commonalities between priorities at the EU and US level, indeed, as you rightly pointed out. I don't see any, there is one question. So I'm reading now from the Q&A. Probably, it's a question from the audience, and maybe we can park it for later for the Q&A session. Once we have heard from the other speakers, especially from Monica from the EMA. But thank you for the question anyway, Cesar. Now we have the pleasure now to have as the next speaker Phyllis Arthur and David Thomas, and we will deep dive a little bit more into the practical consequences for the biotech sector, and also, I mean, having probably also a deeper look at the COVID-19 pipeline. And I mean, I've seen the slides in advance, and they're really, really, really interesting. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. We have so Phyllis Arthur and David Thomas. Phyllis, you are the Vice President for Infectious Disease and Diagnostics Policy at Bio. In this role, you're responsible for working with the member companies in vaccines, antimicrobial resistance, molecular diagnostics, and biodefense in policy and regulatory issues. We also have David Thomas. David, you are the Vice President for Industry Research at Bio, covering investment, R&D, and alliance deal trends, as well as regulatory statistics that impact policy initiatives in Washington. So Phyllis and David, again, a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours. And normally you should be able to control the slides if you want. If you hover your mouse over the slides, otherwise I'm happy to do it.
Okay, can you advance to the next slide?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Dave's gonna start.
I think we just have to do it that way. I don't think I can control it from here. Okay, so my job this year has really been to keep track of the COVID pipeline. So I'll give you an update on the industry response and where we are with the pipeline, and then turn it over to Phyllis for more details, in particular on the vaccine front and the government response to help the industry move those products along faster than we've ever seen before. I want to show you that we have a tracker for the pipeline that's updated every Monday. And you can see the URL here at the bio.org website, COVID pipeline tracker. But in there, you can take a deep dive into the countries, who's making the most products for COVID, what types of strategies they're using, what types of molecules, and even for the late stage programs, a link that takes you to the company website or the clinical trial website as well. So it's very interactive. If you want to look only at vaccines, for example, you can click on vaccines, and all the other interactive platforms will change just to vaccines. So I wanted to start off by letting you know there's a lot more than what I'll show you here in these. What I have really is 2 more slides. So if you advance to the next slide. So on the left, what you see is the response from the industry on a week-by-week basis when there has been a press release that a company is joining the battle against COVID, and really starting early in January, as soon as the sequence for the genome of the virus was released from China, companies started to create vaccines, antibodies, and come up with a lot of solutions. And you can see that was really ramping up in the springtime, March and April and May. But even this week alone, we've seen 15 new compounds enter into the COVID pipeline. So it's been about 10 per week on average, 10 to 15. And it hasn't slowed down even, this is as of September 18th. So far, 764 programs have been launched since January. The country breakdown on where those molecules actually come from, over 50% are coming from the United States. Now, after the United States, this has rocked back and forth. It used to be China and Switzerland were back and forth, but here you see the UK, Germany, Canada, and Switzerland. But there's every couple of weeks that shifts around as the pipeline grows. And a lot of these products actually are products that were repurposed, drugs that had been on the market, for example, for inflammation, that are being pulled into the pipeline. And some of the others hadn't been approved, but they were ongoing projects by companies around the world, and they have been put in. In terms of the company size, if you look at the origin of the drug, over 70% come from small companies, and that actually is very similar to what we see in oncology and in other indications, where it's really the small companies that you have to support if you want true innovation. This is a common theme in biotech. Only 16% are multinational companies, and even smaller, 10% come from universities or other nonprofit research institutes. Okay, next slide. So of the 764 programs that have been launched, right now 728 are remaining active in that pipeline. And the reason is that some of these have actually moved on into this green bar here, which is the emergency use authorization. Some of them are now failing in the clinic, so we have readouts, and some of them look like they'll never be completed because they started off in a geographic area where they've run out of patients, or there are reasons mechanistically where there are other scientific details that suggest that the drug is not going to work and they've been put on hold. In the US, we have remdesivir and recently the convalescent plasma that have been authorized. And in the UK and elsewhere outside the US, dexamethasone, the steroids, are being used in that late stage COVID-19 and a few other compounds in other countries. In terms of vaccines, in the US, we have these two here in China and in Russia that were, even prior to phase 3 trials, authorized and put into use into the population. But those phase 3s are still ongoing. Down below, you see a pie chart of the clinical stage programs. So of those 728 that remain, there are 276 clinical stage programs. And we break the pipeline down 3 ways. Okay, the vaccines, of course, which would likely be used prophylactically, and the antivirals. Those are drugs that are going to be combating the virus or the pathway of the virus. There are 41 and 44 of those in the clinic. So a number of these programs, 700 sounds like a lot. Some of these programs are really, really early stage. But if you just look at the clinical programs, that's what we need to zero in on what's going to happen in the next 6 months in terms of readouts and potential therapies. The biggest bucket is on the treatment side. So 195 treatments for the illness itself. So when there's an overwhelming inflammation response, for example, the drugs that treat the inflammation. So Phyllis is going to talk about the 6 late-stage products on the vaccine pipeline. And I'll just give you a takeaway here for how many drugs we might see reading out with data that can be used as a potential product in the next 3 to 6 months. In the antiviral section, we include antibodies against the virus in that antiviral section. And there are 2 antibodies that within the next month are going to have late stage phase 3 data readout and potentially be authorized for use. The companies behind there, Eli Lilly and Abcelera, and they've released some preliminary data already, and Regeneron in the United States. On the other side of antivirals, we have 2 different groups, those that are antivirals that actually bind to the virus itself and those that disrupt its ability to replicate. And really what we have are 5 programs in that ability to replicate bucket. And we hope to see those certainly in the fall and potentially into December on those 5 programs. So all the rest are in that treatment bucket, and you can see that most of them are anti-inflammatory, but we also have 4 products we hope to see soon read out that are early on in the COVID pathway or pathogenesis, and that is to stimulate the immune system. Some of these are proteins that you can inhale, and we've seen some preliminary data suggesting that those show promise. We also now understand that the COVID-19 disease is a blood disease, it's a vascular disease, it's a coagulation disease, it's many different things, but blood being very important. There are now 9 products about to be reading out in late stage phase 3 or phase 4 trials. And lastly, we also know that the virus is going after the heart. It can take down the kidneys, it can get in the brain. So there are organ-specific drugs that are trying to combat that that later stage or even long stage COVID, and there are 8 products. Hopefully we have data on those by the end of the year. So that's a summary of the numbers behind the pipeline. And again, if you want to know the details of the companies behind it and the mechanisms, I would go back to that the bio.org website and look at the tracker, and you can find those details. And with that, I will hand it over to Phyllis. You have your mic on, Phyllis.
Here we go. Emma, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. I was saying every time you do that, I learn something new. So thank you so much for it. It's always really helpful. Next slide, please. So it's very nice to talk with you today. I'm going to do a little bit of a drill down on some of the vaccines, as that's one area where there's been so much movement and activity and discussion. So this chart really maps out where the various vaccines are in their development, and we have this cluster of vaccines that are now in late phase development, phase 3. You see, Dave referred to the 2 vaccines that currently have emergency use authorization: the CanSino vaccine and the vaccine from the Gamaleya Research Institute, Sputnik 5. And then you have several vaccines in later stage from some of the large multinationals. What Joe alluded to before, many of these products actually reflect the excellent partnerships that are happening between small and large biotech and biopharma to bring some of these great products to market. And they also reflect some of the excellent work done in advance of the pandemic by CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. So many of the vaccines that are now being carried forward by our large global vaccine manufacturers and developers were originally funded by CEPI for either COVID or other reasons, other vaccine diseases like SARS or MERS. So this is true for the Moderna product, for the product from Themis, the product from IAVI. So these products are now moving forward and proving out our idea of investing in novel platform approaches to vaccines that can allow us to quickly pivot from one virus to another and really have more rapid development of these vaccines as we respond to a pandemic. So you'll see, we're very excited to see these various products enter into late phase. Johnson & Johnson entered phase 3 just the other day. And actually, I think it was yesterday, announced the start of a 60,000 person global trial. Pfizer's trial is again 60,000 people globally, with an extra, instead of doing just 30,000 in the US, they're doing 44,000 people. So Novavax announced recently that they plan to enter phase 3 at the end of this month. And so I think we're seeing really swift but focused movement with the use of the very strong protocols for phase 3 issued by the FDA, the EMA, and WHO. Next slide, please. Next. Oh, so I wanted to actually talk more about the partnerships going on around these vaccines. And I wanted to start, of course, with the global perspective, which is the standing up of the COVAX facility. So I hope that many of you know that the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, Gavi, which is a cornerstone organization based in Geneva that works to bring vaccines to the poorest countries in the world, and the World Health Organization, all work together within the ACT Accelerator to put together a pillar around vaccines and to support vaccine R&D, including supporting not just the research and development, but the manufacturing scale up. So important to bring billions of doses to the world. They work together to actually pool procurement such that we could have the equitable and even distribution of vaccines around the world in a way that was systematic, in a way that had clear allocation guidelines, and that was based on the most important populations to vaccinate. And the World Health Organization actually performs this key role of putting together the policies, the allocation principles, and of course acts as a key almost super regulator or acts in a certain regulatory capacity in partnership with the key regulators to make sure the product has pre-qualification and can go around the world as needed. These three organizations have worked very closely together with all the different member countries, as well as our industry, to put together a very thoughtful approach to the equitable access to vaccines. And we were very pleased as Bio and as industry generally to see that the COVAX facility this week made some key announcements on the countries that are entering the facility and hoping to partner together for this endeavor. So 64 high-income countries or economies are joining the facility, and they expect almost 40 more to announce their intent in the coming days. The self-financing economies may have their own bilateral deals with different vaccine developers, but they're committing not just resources, but potentially doses to the actual COVAX activities. In addition, 92 low-income countries will be able to use the advanced market commitment deal that will be done by Gavi with the vaccine developers to bring doses to the low-income countries around the world. So we have an excellent first foray into the ability to equitably get vaccine around the world. And again, our industry is supportive of this. And I think you'll hopefully see over the coming weeks the announcement of some of the commitments by specific vaccine developers to doses to the COVAX facility in response to the commitment of the countries. So their goal of the COVAX facility is to raise about $2 billion by the end of this year, and more, of course, in the coming years, and deliver 2 billion doses by the end of next year. And they have a 3-year plan for delivering multiple billions of doses around the world. Next slide. I think you'll note that the U.S. has taken a different approach, although I hope that we will see as well that the U.S. might also apply some of its doses to the COVAX facility over the long term. But the U.S. has done bilateral deals with a host of companies of varying sizes, and similar in a way to the way CEPI has done their portfolio. The U.S. and CEPI have followed a similar strategy, which is to fund vaccines in development across a host of different technologies, such that we will hopefully see multiple different approaches that are successful in the clinic and successfully used in various countries that could be targeted to various populations depending on their safety, their efficacy in those populations. So you're seeing across the board funding for R&D, manufacturing scale up, and eventual procurement of different vaccines by the U.S. government to the tune of about, it's about $4 billion here, but overall about $11 billion in terms of investment in not just the work of the vaccine companies, but the work to support extra fill and finish capacity, extra manufacturing capacity, as well as other issues within the vaccine response and the overall COVID-19 response. So one of the things that we have been discussing with the US government in terms of preparedness is how can these investments we're making in broader manufacturing capacity, especially sterile fill and finish capacity, which is always a bottleneck for vaccines and actually could also be an important bottleneck for the arrival of certain biologics like monoclonal antibodies. How can we work together to invest in some public-private partnership around that key bottleneck we all face worldwide that could help us in responding to a pandemic? This is an extremely important issue. I think that CEPI and Gavi and the US government all have had to try to work quickly to find places to scale up production in an unprecedented way over the last 3 or 4 months. And that has fostered some really important discussion about investing in these technologies around the world, investing in shared capacity around the world. And most importantly, what I hope lasts from this whole pandemic is the investment and partnership on the private sector side between small companies, large companies, and developing country vaccine manufacturers and global contract manufacturing organizations, where we can leverage the entire industrial base for biopharma to actually respond to a pandemic through private sector partnerships that can endure. So that's my last comment, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about how the vaccine response has gone around the world. I think that's my last slide, Laurent.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Phyllis and David. I think it's been really eye-opening, and I mean the figures and the slide you have shown are really, exemplifying the response from the biotech sector globally as well. And I think that it really demonstrates that when with the support of public bodies, we also can really upscale the response as well. No, unless we have one burning question from the audience or from the panel. I'm also looking at the time. I mean, as you know, that's my role as the host of the meeting as well. I propose maybe we can already move on to the next speaker. If I move my slide, yeah. I mean, and I think it actually is a very nice follow-up from the slide we've just seen from Phyllis and Dave. Our next speaker, I think, is Monica Diaz from the European Medicines Agency, and I think we can all agree that, well, during the pandemic, the EMA has been very reactive in terms of proposing solutions to all stakeholders to really ensure we conduct research as before, but also we assess medicines or we propose available products to the European citizens through the EMA. So, Monica, you are a Principal Policy and Crisis Coordinating Officer at the EMA. You are leading the workstream #2 of the EMA COVID-19 task force, focusing on the supply chain issues. And yeah, well, I think that you are the very right person we would like to hear from today on these very, very, I would say, important items for all of us. So, Monica, please, the floor is yours, and you can control the slides if you want, or you can also, I can also navigate through the slides.
Thank you, and either good morning or good afternoon to you. I hope you can hear me well. I was having some problems in hearing you now that I switched on the video, so I hope that all runs smoothly. So in the next 10 minutes, I will try to give you an overview of EMA's response to the pandemic, in particular in relation to availability of medicines in Europe. So if we could move to the next slide. And the one after that. So, but before we start, I would like to give you an overview of how shortages are managed in the EU. Then I'll move on to a high-level overview of how we responded to the pandemic. Then I'll talk about the recently established EU Executive Steering Group on shortages caused by major events. I will also touch upon the industry single point of contact, which was set up as well in the context of the pandemic. The most recent activities within the EU Executive Steering Group that relate to the forecasting of demand data in the EU. And last but not least, I will touch upon the regulatory flexibilities that were put in place in the context of the COVID pandemic in order to prevent or mitigate shortages. So the next slide, please. So a little bit of background on how shortages are actually managed in the EU. So it is availability of medicines. It is a very important, a key priority for the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And it is important to note that in the EU, most of the shortages are nonetheless dealt at national level by the national competent authorities. But even before the COVID pandemic, the situation was deteriorating in Europe, and the network decided to set up the task force, the HMA-EMA task force on availability of authorized medicines. And it was set up in order to provide a strategic support and advice in order to try to address supply issues for both human and veterinary medicines and ensure continued availability of medicines. There are several outputs of the work of this task force, but one important one that I would refer to you today is that in April of 19, the task force established what is so-called a single point of contact network. And this is consists of a single point of contact in each national competent authority in the EU that it will be responsible for all issues related to shortages. And the aim here is to exchange information between member states, us, EMA, and also the European Commission on shortages of critical medicines. Also within this exchange, we share information on alternative medicines that may be available in other member states. I think it is important to also mention that during the COVID, the EU SPOC network, as we call it, so the single point of contact network within the regulatory agencies had to step up their work and as reviewing shortages of medicines regularly. Also, we've done a collection of demand data from the member states for the 14 APIs that were under export restriction by the Indian government. We also collected information on shortages of medicines in the ICU, and that information was then sent to the health commissioner that subsequently provided that information to pharmaceutical industries in order for them to increase production of those medicines. So this is just to already mention what was done at the level of the EU SPOC network. Next slide, please. So, but just to go beyond the USPOC network, what has EMA done? So we've really gone beyond our legal remit, and we've set up the EU Executive Steering Group of medicines caused by major events. This group meets or was meeting initially every week, also with industry associations, and EUCOPE participated in our weekly meetings. Then towards the end of May or beginning of June, then we reduced the frequency of these meetings of the EU Executive Steering Group and also with industry associations. What we've done as well at the level of the agency is very early in the pandemic, we launched a survey to all MAHs of centrally authorized products to understand what would be the impact of the COVID pandemic on the availability of caps. We had a very low response rate from MAHs, but for those that indicated there were potential availability issues, we continue liaising with them, see whether EMA could support them in either preventing or mitigating these shortages. And as I mentioned already, we've also launched the so-called industry single point of contact, the ISPOC, in April of 2020. And this has been set up as a fast monitoring system for a subset of medicines used in ICU for COVID patients. And the aim here was to prevent, again, or mitigate the supply issues. Next slide, please. So what is the EU Executive Steering Group? Again, here provides strategic leadership for any needed coordinated actions that will help prevent shortages or mitigate them. And this is, of course, during the pandemic. It is composed of representatives from EMA, from the European Commission. We also have 7 heads of medicines agencies, and we have the CMDH and CMDV represented, and we also have risk communication specialists. Perhaps I can mention already that during our most recently discussions on forecasting demand data, we've now extended the EU Executive Steering Group to all heads of medicines responsible for human medicines. The group is chaired by the European Commission, and as I mentioned, it met with industry associations on a weekly basis, and now usually we meet on a bi-weekly basis. And we've also restarted the meetings with industry associations. We provide regular updates on the progress that is made by the Executive Steering Group in our website. Next slide, please. So going back to the ISPOC system, and this is different from what I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the EU SPOC system. So the EU SPOC system are single points of contacts in EU regulatory authorities, all NCAs. In the EU, the ISPOC system is an industry contact point that we have for each of the medicines that are under the ISPOC reporting system that was set up as a request of pharmaceutical industry. and was agreed by the executive steering group and launched, as I mentioned, in April of this year. So what does that allow? It allows a direct reporting from MAHs of any supply shortages for crucial medicines, but not only centrally authorized products as we receive now, so we receive notifications of shortages for all centrally authorized products, but also for nationally authorized products. So for the first time, EMA is actually receiving information about shortages of all products, caps and naps, but this is to a subset of medicines used in ICU settings. So we have a total of 31 medicines. Now, also important to mention that the existing reporting of shortages for nationally authorized products continues as it always been. So we have this in addition, in parallel to the reporting to the concerned NCAs. So as I mentioned, what is the aim of the ISPOC system? It is to prevent shortages from occurring in the first place. And why? Because we look at the root causes, and the aim here is to address the root causes or enable any mitigating actions through the discussions at the executive steering group and subsequent actions. So there could be further regulatory flexibility or any actions by the European Commission or at level of the member states that can facilitate, for instance, in relation to export restrictions. And we had the case there with the export restrictions that were imposed by the Indian government, and even some export restrictions that were imposed by some member states during the first phase of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So now, more recently, we've been looking as well at the first phase of the pandemic and how can we prepare best for a second wave of the pandemic. And here, the executive steering group is discussing how to improve the forecast of demand data of medicines used in the ICU for COVID patients, as well as then once we have improved the forecast of the demand data, how can we best match demand with the available supply. So in order to do so, the EU Executive Steering Group has established an ad hoc working group that was tasked to develop common framework for not only collecting, but for then sharing that data within the UEA. So we are setting up a set of common principles for forecasting demand to ensure that once that information is aggregated at EU level, we are aggregating comparable data from each of the member states. Also, this ad hoc working group on forecasting demand data has also been tasked to determine what are the medicines that will be included in this exercise. It's important to mention that the work that has been done by the ad hoc working group on setting these principles for forecasting demand data, it is in preparation for the second wave of the pandemic, for any subsequent waves of the pandemic, but also for any other pandemics or indeed any other situations where demand data will be needed within the EU. So the work has been done not exclusively for the second wave, but also for other situations. Next slide, please. So one other output of the EU Executive Steering Group has been the regulatory flexibilities that were very quickly put in place by the European Medicines Regulatory Network to prevent or mitigate shortages. So we've published the first version of this Q&A on the 10th of April, and we have subsequently updated, and after the 10th of April, we updated quite quickly this Q&A, and the last update was done in July. We have not had any updates since then. And this Q&A is really important for MAHs to consider when they're looking at ways to mitigate shortages of medicines. So some of the examples, I will not go through the entire Q&A in detail, but in the next slides, I will just highlight some of the flexibilities that are available. So we have, for instance, the ECMP, the Exceptional Change Management Process, which allowed implementation of changes to, for instance, suppliers, new suppliers, or indeed new manufacturing or quality control sites to the marketing authorization. And how it works is there is a need for a prior notification at least 2 working days before the implementation. And but then the actual full assessment of the variation is deferred and is only done after the submission after 6 months, so up to 6 months. So then companies have up to 6 months to submit the corresponding variation. But of course, this excludes marketing authorization extensions. And I think it's very important also to say that it's limited only to medicines for use in COVID patients. So it's not for all medicines. But here the idea of the ECMP is really to facilitate increase in capacity for MAHs. As we've seen, of course, during the first wave of the pandemic, the main reason for the shortages was an unexpected increase in demand. So the idea here was to facilitate as much as possible the increased production by pharmaceutical companies, but facilitating that process as well. Next slide, please. Other elements of the Q&A relate as well to GMP and GDP certificate in inspection. So for instance, the regulatory flexibilities now extend the validity of the GMP and the GDP certificates until the end of 2021, which is certainly going to facilitate the situation. Now, because of the pandemic, it also provides guidance in relation to remote GMP inspections that are also possible during the pandemic. There is also adaptations to the work of the qualified person. Again, remote activities are possible. And there are additional set of temporary GMP and GDP flexibilities, but there are conditions and limitations that are described in the guidance. If we move to the next slide, please. So these additional temporary GMP flexibilities are again only limited in scope to the crucial medicines for use in COVID-19 patients, so not all medicines, but include, for instance, limited prospective qualification when you introduce a new equipment. Also concurrent validation of a manufacturing process, but it's important to mention that there is always need for a regulatory procedure to be submitted. It also allows the postponement or waiving of testing in a third country, and also postponement of certain tests in the EU. But of course, the Q&A then gives further discussions on all the conditions that are needed for those flexibilities to apply. So this is just to give you a flavor of the regulatory flexibilities that were put in place. Another output of the EU Executive Steering Group, and we believe that this has helped pharmaceutical companies to ensure continued supply for patients in Europe, medicines, in particular those crucial medicines for COVID patients. Perhaps I will stop here. This is my last slide, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have either now or during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica, for your intervention. And yes, there is one question, but I think for the sake of time, because we are almost approaching the end of our webinar, we will take this question because I really want to take it, but during the Q&A session, if that's okay with you. Now, moving on to the next speakers of today. I mean, we've heard a lot, of course, about the massive recovery measures and also I would say plans from the EU or the US, but what about the national level? We know that no country has been spared by the pandemic, but can we already see maybe some coherence between all the national recovery plans? So to enlighten us on this regard, we have with us today Antoine Jourdan from the Ministry of Economic Affairs in France. Antoine, you are a Director of Health Industry at the General Directorate for Companies, DGE, at the Ministry of Economic Affairs in France. And you will tell us a little bit more about the France Relance Plan, the recent plan, which is actually full of ambitious measures to make France as competitive as before the COVID-19 pandemic. So
right.
Again, thank you, Antoine. And you don't have any slides, so please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Right. So very quickly, so I work for the economic ministry in France, and so I'm head of the healthcare industries department in the economy ministry in France. Just for fellow Americans out there, just so you know, on a personal note, I was born in New York. I grew up in Chicago, and so because I'm going to be talking about how fantastic France is to grow your business. Just as a note, I'm also loving living here as well, on the personal note. So anyway, so talking about our plan for the recovery, going back a little bit on the actual COVID crisis in France. So I believe the crisis was quite a wake-up call on a number of elements in terms of our ambitions for healthcare industries, with a strong realization that there were a number of dependencies within our system with a number of healthcare products that came from other countries, especially from in Asia. And so there's this strong willingness with the France Relance Plan to try to achieve several objectives. First, we want to massively increase the resilience of our system, which means obviously our objective is not to make sure that healthcare industries all come and produce in France. That's not what resilience is all about. What resilience is about is making sure that production centers are properly disseminated around the world, so that if you have an earthquake in a certain region of the globe, or like other natural disasters in certain regions of the globe, to make sure that our supply, at least in France and in Europe, is ensured. So obviously, because I do work for the for the economic ministry, so obviously we are very favorable to all kinds of production investments directly on the national territory. But from a resilience perspective, essentially we need to have a certain number of factories that are located directly in Europe. The second objective of the France Relance Plan is to massively increase the attractivity of the country for healthcare industries. So I know there's a number of, so France is an attractive country as it is, but like we would want to make it the best place to be in, to innovate, to create new molecules, to create new medical devices, and to innovate with artificial intelligence and exploiting data for healthcare. If I go a little bit into the details of what we're trying to do with our plan, and if I can find the proper papers, there you go. So just in 2020, to give you an idea of the amount of money the government's putting into place around this plan, there's already 220 million euros just right now to be used before the end of 2020 for industry relocalization. So that's 120 million euros just for productive investments on factories, on research around COVID, and another 100 million euros that are used to incite and incentivize businesses to come and invest into new plants and factories to produce, I don't know, the new molecules for tomorrow in the country. There's also and so that's just the beginning in 2020. Obviously, this plan is over several number of years. Our president has talked several times already in the past 2 to 3 weeks about the willingness of the country to be able to recover entirely from an economic perspective by 2022. So that leaves us 2 years to make sure that our economy is back on track compared to the situation in January of this year. On top of that, so France is showing a lot of willingness in Europe. So right now, there's you must have heard Ursula von der Leyen speak last week. France has quite a lot of ideas on how we can actually leverage the European level to make sure that, first of all, citizens on this continent gain access to all the healthcare products that they need, and secondly, that the system is resilient to major crises, and thirdly, to make sure that as a whole, the continent stays as attractive for innovation as possible. Now, I do want to say though, so I'm talking to an international audience, so that you don't necessarily realize everything that's happening at a political level here in the country. the general climate right now at the end of September 2020 has nothing in common with the general climate in January 2020 for healthcare industries. So at the beginning of this year, we would always be talking about, resilience and the same kind of debate you have in the US as well, about how you would have industries locating themselves in lower wages this country, etc. But nobody was really taking care of the topic. Then COVID hit. And I really believe now that we're in September, that there's really a before and an after COVID for healthcare industries. And this paradigm shift is making a lot of things change right now in terms of simplifying access to market in France, or streamlining processes so that you can go as fast as possible from a health perspective, from your research and development all the way to production and delivering to patients, and making sure that entire process is as simple as possible at every stage. So linking with universities, finding financing, or like even 50 million or even 100 million euros financing for your business, gaining very quick access to market, because just like me, that time is money. Making sure that you can produce your innovation on that local territory and can recruit very highly qualified people as well for your business. And we want to make sure that that entire process is streamlined, made extremely simple, so that France, which is already a very attractive country, trust me, to live in, becomes the most attractive country in the world for healthcare industry innovation. I hope that makes sense. So I'm happy to go into more detail, but I am aware of time right now. So Laurent, I will leave the floor to you again.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you for the very interesting point of view of France, and for giving us this updates on how France is about to fight for this recovery. So now, as the last speaker, let's hear from the biotech industry. We have, if I go to my next slide, we have Julien Patrice from Untitled. Julien, you are country lead for Belgium and Luxembourg and head of policy for Europe for Untitled, and you will go with us through basically the long-term or mid-term consequences for biotech in a post-COVID era. Julien, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for giving us the opportunity at Untitled to provide our perspective on that important topic. So as you mentioned, the goal of my presentation would be to take a slightly different angle from the previous presenter, and just to try to see maybe in the mid to long term, what is the environment looking like and how it will impact healthcare systems and biotech companies. And as you all know, it's a very hard exercise, because the reality shows that changes happen on a day-to-day basis right now. So I think that there is a high uncertainty that we are all facing, and it's a bit of a crystal ball exercise. So I think that my presentation has to be taken in that context, and probably I will raise more questions than I bring answer, and I apologize for that. But before I start, just in terms of perspective, I think it's useful to, next slide. Yeah. Just to explain our perspective, I think that it's good to go back to who we are at Untitled. And basically, Untitled is a biotech company that was founded in 2002. We're based in Cambridge, Boston, and we are leading the creation of a new category of medicines that is based on RNAi, or RNA interference. So RNA interference is basically a natural cellular process of gene silencing. So what that means in practice is that RNAi therapeutics are meant to address the disease at their root cause. So conventional therapeutics would address the symptoms of a disease. What RNAi do is to basically target and silence some proteins or other components that can be inducing of the disease. So that's what gene silencing is. And in fact, the discovery of RNAi was so important for biology in general that it was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2006. Now, Untitled was founded already in 2002 with the vision that we could transform that scientific possibility into a therapeutic reality for patients. And we spent 17 years as a research organization before being able to bring our first product to market in 2018, as you see. And not only 17 years, but also more than $3 billion invested in research. Now we have a second product that is authorized in Europe. And the thing that is really interesting, I think, is that we have a vibrant pipeline with more than 10 research programs. Some of them still in the rare disease space where we started, but most importantly in other more common disease areas, including COVID, even though we are at an early stage compared to some of the products that we have seen before. And the reason why I think that's particularly interesting is that it shows how innovation in rare disease can actually lead to economies of scale and learning capabilities that can go across the rare disease space and really solve some more public health related issues. The other thing that is interesting in the history of Alnylam is the fact that now that we are transitioning from a purely research organization to a commercial organization, we are investing massively worldwide, but also in Europe in setting up the infrastructure necessary to bring our drug to patients. That means that basically when I joined Alnylam in 2017, I was employee number 30. Fast forward 3 years, we are 250 and more employees in Europe. We have offices in 11 countries. We have set up our infrastructure capabilities to ensure the supply and distribution of our products. And more importantly, we continue what we've done for many years, which is to partner in research with European research centers and the medical community. And the reason why it's important, I believe, is that it's a good example, just an example of what biotech and the biotech industry stand for and what it can bring not only for science, innovation, but also for the economy. So from that perspective, next slide. What to expect from COVID-19 for a company like Alnylam? So I think that we need to start from the stark economic reality. We are in a recession. It's not a matter of whether it will happen or not. It's a matter of how long and how hard it will impact us. And I think that we need to acknowledge the historic efforts that are done at European and national level that are unprecedented and historic. And that will obviously and hopefully put us back on the path to recovery fast enough. Nevertheless, we can also acknowledge that the public finances are what they are, which public debt and public deficit alike, which were already in the red in some cases in some countries. And I think it's a fair question to ask to anticipate what would be the implications for healthcare spending and pharmaceutical spending in particular. Next slide. So to do that, I think that it's good to learn from the past. And the best analogy I can think of right now is the 2008 economic crisis. So as many of you know, that crisis was accompanied by cost containment measures. And it's true enough, those cost containment measures and the intensity was variable across Europe. So it's hard to generalize. But I think it's fair to say that in many countries, we observed policies such as price cut, increase of taxes, payback discounts. Alexander referred to many of them before, so I'm going to stress more of them. But those measures that took place in particular in the countries that were the worst hit by the crisis were also happening in other countries. So as a result, we have seen some relative decrease in pharmaceutical spending across the region. Now that's what happened in 2008. And so if that's a textbook, so to say, and we apply it to biotech tomorrow, what is going to happen? Next slide. Next slide, please. Sorry, Tom. So I think to anticipate or to try to assess what that impact might be, we need to take a step back and go back, what is the biotech industry? And so that's why I use the example of Alnylam. If you think about it, 17 years, no revenues, more than 3 billion invested in research. And even today that we start having some commercial revenues with our first products, we invest massively into research to develop a broad pipeline to ensure our financial sustainability. In addition to reinvesting in research, we have also, as I said, to invest in the infrastructure that is necessary to bring our product to patients, hiring people, setting up offices, etc. That means basically that we are not profitable. And we are far from an isolated case. So as biostatistics shows, only 8% of publicly traded biotech companies are actually profitable. And that's the stark reality of the biotech sector. And for that reason, you need to anticipate that the cost containment environment can have a disproportionate impact on those young companies that rely on one or maybe two products and have some significant need for investment in order to not only continue their research, but set up their businesses across the world. What that means is that if they don't have the revenues that are necessary, you could have an impact in terms of R&D programs that are decelerated or canceled. And ultimately, that means that access to innovation in some areas where there are no treatment available can be impacted. But beyond the public health impact that we often hear about, I think that there is another one. It's an opportunity cost. And if you go to the next slide, I think that the best way to look at, next slide. No? That's okay. So by opportunity costs, what I mean is that looking at what a vibrant biotech ecosystem can look like, it can do, not only for health and innovation, but also for the economy. And so I take the example of Cambridge, Boston, because that's where we are from, and I know a bit about it. And there are the worldwide cluster in the US and in Europe. But what is really striking is that if you take Cambridge and Boston, there are more than 70,000 employees working in biotech. There are more than 500 biotech companies that are in there, and that concentration is also is in fact contributing to the growth of employment in the region, and far more than other industries, you can see. But it's not job alone; it's also a massive amount of capital that are invested in those companies, and 3.1 billion alone in 2019. But even beyond biotech, what is absolutely stunning about biotech ecosystem is that it's cross-sectoral. We have also biopharma, bigger company that are based in Cambridge and Boston. You also have digital tech and fintech, all these stakeholders working together and advancing the innovation of tomorrow in healthcare, in pharmaceutical, and otherwise. And I think that the question that I'd like to raise is, what do we want to do now in terms of going out of the recession? Do we want to use the textbook of the past and to basically weather the storm with our pharmaceutical policy and focus on cost containment? Or do we want to emerge as a leader and actually take a bet on biotech and invest in growth and use that as a strategy outside of the crisis? And to a large extent, some people actually answered to that question before me. So if you go to the next slide, okay. Yeah, so some countries like the Netherlands have taken already many years ago the bet on setting up a vibrant international worldwide biotech ecosystem. And they did that with a bold public policy to help homegrown companies to develop themselves, but also by approaching companies worldwide, such as Alnylam in the US or otherwise, in investing and setting their operations in Europe. So that's one example. The other example we heard about is the most welcome France Relance plan and the importance of life sciences within that plan. But closer to home, for those of you that are living in Brussels, we need to acknowledge also that health is an important part of the ambitious recovery plan. So we need more of these things. That would be my hypothesis. And actually, on next slide, in addition to public policy, I think the private sector has also a responsibility to reinvent itself to make sure that vibrant biotech ecosystem means also a sustainable biotech ecosystem. What that means in practice is that perhaps rethinking access is a way to just have a true win-win. And we have recent example in the news of new innovative access deals and combine fast access to innovation, a reward of innovation, but also mechanism to ensure sustainability with some risk sharing, clinical and otherwise. And in addition to that, sometimes now, even some public-private partnership that involves some reinvestment in the local healthcare system or the local economy. And I think the private sector has an opportunity there to try to find this new way to look at access so that it's genuinely an investment and not only cost. And so that brings me to my conclusion of the presentation, which is the next slide. We are sitting at a crossroad today. We're contemplating many policy issues that will change the face of life science or biotech as we know it tomorrow. One being the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, but many national efforts also. And the question is will we use the 2008 textbook, or will we try something new and innovative and bold and bet on biotech and its opportunity for Europe? That's it.
Thank you very much. Let me put my camera on. Thank you very much, Julien, for your insight from Alnylam and indeed how a concrete example of how a biotech company responded and some very excellent food for thought for the next years and for the midterm consequences. Now I think it's time to open the Q&A session and there is one question, and it is for you, Monica, from the EMA. It's a question from Pablo Serrano, and I will read it out to you. Many people are having serious thoughts about receiving vaccines with substances that have been developed so fast. So how can the EMA help to convince the population that the vaccines authorizations will be made under the current high standards?
Yes, thank you. I think I have that question, I think, in every single conference I attend. Is not the first time. And I think it is a fair question to be made. But I think the important thing to remember is that the agency will keep the same high standards that has been using throughout the years. So that will not change. I think what we have in place is a number of, let's say, new initiatives that will facilitate then the approval process. So we have, for instance, the rapid scientific advice procedure. So we engage very early in the development with the companies, and that helps the development. And then we have also the rolling review. So the companies, as the results of the studies are finalized, they submit, they are assessed, and then they continue to submit more. So this is what is called the rolling review, and we can speed up the review process considerably. I think in order to gain confidence from patients, I think we have to work on communication. So we have to communicate. We have to make that information available to patients so that they understand what has been the process for the approval of these medicines once they are submitted and then subsequently approved. I think this is a very important thing. So it's communication and is also transparency. So trying to make as much data available as possible as soon as these medicines, either vaccines or therapeutics, are go through the regulatory process, is making sure that we have the underpinning clinical data available as well. So that shows transparency, and I think that will certainly give confidence to patients to be confident that the standards have been kept.
Thank you very much, Monica, for your answer. Now we are already a little bit running late, so if that's okay with all of you, I think we can move on to the concluding remarks from Alexander. Alex, please, the floor is yours for the conclusion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurent, first of all, for organizing that, also to Bio, and again to the colleagues from the Ministry of Economics in France, but also to EMA. I think that meeting or webinar has shown that it's all about collaboration. We heard about the role of EMA, which is critical. We also heard about national governments, how critical it is to coordinate. And I think for me, the lessons learned of the crisis is very much about talking early, preventing things by talking early and collaborating. And I don't want to have a very long final remark here, but I think there is more to come. And I would also like to mention that at the end of the day, I think it's a common effort to work on a vaccine first and foremost, to be made available to patients. It's not only to be for the authorization of that vaccine to take place, but also to grant supply and grant availability for patients. I think that's critical. And that, again, has shown that there's a lot of collaboration ongoing, even within industry, where you wouldn't have foreseen a collaboration on production issues and so on and so forth. So thank you very much, all the participants. Also, thank you very much to all the speakers here for the webinar, for being with us today. And it's, as Joe said, it's probably a good starting point for further collaboration with Bio and with all the other colleagues in EMA and in the ministry. Thanks to all of you. Have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And we will now be closing the meeting. And I would like to also thank personally Hilary from Bio for supporting this event. And we'll now be closing the meeting. You will receive a follow-up email with some further details from today's meeting. And thank you again for joining us. Goodbye and stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laurent.
Bye.
Bye.